The the start is going to be a pretty very high level overview of kind of energy things in Michigan. I will say that my expertise, and I should really say my name, I'm Eli Gold. Um, I work for a consulting firm that's based in Michigan. We work around the Midwest. My specialty is really kind of siting policy for large scale renewables and more on the electric sector side. So while I can answer some questions about other facets of energy issues in Michigan, that's the area where I have the most expertise. Um, and yeah, and so let's take from there. It's going to start very high level, and it's going to kind of get into some of the most recent policy that was passed in 2023, and we'll give most of the focus to that. So let me see if I can figure out how to get into presenter view properly. How does that look to everybody?
Looks good.
Okay, so what's going on in Michigan climate policy with a focus on the electric sector. So just a kind of really brief overview of Michigan's greenhouse gases. You have about a quarter from electricity, a quarter from transportation, a quarter from the built environment, and then 15% from energy intensive industries and 6% from agriculture. Um, I I don't know how this varies state to state, but it's a good starting point. This is also, a similar chart, except this is energy consumption by end use sector. So this is, you can see that kind of residential, it's still about quarters, residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation. I think nationwide, transportation is kind of the largest sector now. In Michigan, it's more residential. So, residential energy consumption, that's both end use electricity, but also natural gas for heating and other heating fuels. And then transportation is obviously gas, and industrial is process heats and running the buildings, and commercial is more like residential. It's mostly heating and electricity. Also cooling, of course. And then so here's the electricity grid in Michigan in 2022. So you can see we have a big slice of nuclear still online, a decent chunk of coal, and the biggest slice is natural gas. We have a moderate sized piece of wind. So that's 8% of wind and about 1% of solar currently. And our total electricity use a year is about 118 terawatt hours, if that means anything to you. So, and then solar is the fastest growing sector by far. So while Michigan's solar is still a very small piece of the pie here, it's growing pretty quickly. We brought in another, 500 megawatts or half a gigawatt in 2023. It's on track to continue growing. Whereas wind, which I don't have a chart of, but has slowed down substantially recently. And that's for kind of a mix of reasons. Some is that just the best resource and the easiest to site projects get used up, but there's also some issues with kind of pushback from local governments and non-permitting stuff. And then this is kind of a very, very brief history of Michigan climate policy. It's a overview only. So we passed our first RPS standard in 2008, the Clean, Renewable, and Efficient Energy Act, or PA 295. And that established a 10% renewable portfolio standard that would be serving 10% of emission of electricity with renewable energy by 2015. That was later raised to 15% by 2021. And we've been achieving that. So, mm, and this is at the utility level. So that is to say, individual utilities um, need to be figuring out where to, get all those renewables. They can come in a variety of forms. I'll discuss a little bit of that later. And then in September of 2020, Governor Whitmer made a commitment to 100% carbon neutrality by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement. And at the same time, the Council on Climate Solutions was formed by executive order. In 2022, the Council on Climate Solutions released the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan after a lengthy and inclusive process, including public meetings, listening sessions, as well as a public portal for comment. So this was stolen straight from the source, and it's just a list of all the outreach they did, everything that was kind of covered in that. But the Healthy Climate Plan is really a plan. It's an outline for what we aspire to. It is not legislation. It builds momentum, but it's not binding. And so these are the kind of primary tenets of the Healthy Climate Plan. So mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, spur economic development, and create good paying jobs. Protect and improve the health of Michiganders, position Michigan as a leader in climate action, protect our natural resources and wildlife, make Michigan energy independent, and address environmental injustices. So those were the 7 primary tenets. And then, somewhat unexpectedly, in November 2022 midterms, the Michigan Democrats won a trifecta, and that created an opportunity window for more substantial climate policy to be passed. And those policies were Public Act 235, Public Act 233, which are kind of the largest policies, the ones I'll spend the most time on, but also 231, 232, and 234, which, are also around climate and energy issues. So, the biggest piece of this legislation, the hallmark legislation, is PA 235. And it passed in the end of 2023. And what it is it amends the 2008 Act, the Clean, Renewable, and Efficient Energy Act that we discussed earlier that set that original 10% RPS. And this amends it in a variety of ways, and it starts to codify the pathways laid out in the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. And it also brought municipal utilities and co-ops back into compliance, or they had to achieve this. Prior, it was just IOUs. Investor-owned utilities for those not in the utility space. So this is the basic outline. By 2030, it sets a clean energy standard and a renewable energy standard. So I'll explain that a little bit. But yes, by 2030, 50% needs to be served by renewable energy. So renewable energy is hydropower, solar energy, and wind energy. By 2035, that number needs to go to 60%. And by 2040 and beyond, it stays at 60%. But in 2035 also kicks in the clean energy standard at 80%, and then up to 100% in 2040. So what is that? What is the clean energy standard? So clean energy is a few other items. So predominantly that's nuclear. There's already a lot of nuclear in the mix here. It's plausible that we'll build new nuclear by 2040. It's not horribly likely, although Palisades may come back. I'll talk about that a little later. But it's also, that includes carbon capture and storage. So as well as landfill gas and, biomass. So the carbon capture and storage standard is a kind of a 90% effective carbon capture and storage. So, you're still going to be getting some those extra 10% emissions or whatever is built, there is some kind of language in the law saying that that standard can go up, that 90% standard could go up in line with kind of the best reasonably priced carbon capture technologies. Other parts of PA 235, and there are a lot of them, but the other headline ones is 2,500 megawatts of new storage are mandated. And that has to be at least 4 hours long, so 2,500 megawatts and plus 10,000 megawatt hours. And it also increased the cap on rooftop solar from 1% to 10%. So this was a non-binding cap in some utilities, but was binding in some of the smaller utilities. And what that meant was that any individual utility didn't need to basically interconnect more than 1% of their load worth of rooftop solar. And yeah, again, so in the larger utilities in Michigan, which are DTE and consumers, that cap still wasn't binding, but in some of the smaller northern Michigan UP utilities, that was a binding cap, and now that's been increased to 10%, which would be impressive if we got there. And then we also increased the energy waste reduction requirement from 1.5% per year to 2% per year, and extended that requirement to municipal utilities and co-ops. So the way energy waste reduction works is basically that the utility is supposed to reduce its load by using demand response, or the kind of first thing that people would recognize was utilities distributing LEDs. That was a good way for them to get this count. And then kind of like each other efficient appliances, and each appliance gets a count of a few kilowatt hours or whatever of reduction, and those stack up. And so we increased that yearly percentage of extra energy waste reduction that they're supposed to be reducing through these processes from 1.5% to 2% per year. And there's a variety of other issues in PA 235, but that's what I'll kind of leave the broad discussion on. And then PA 233 was another kind of complicated piece of legislation that sets a path for state siting of large-scale renewable energy projects in Michigan. So that's solar projects that are greater than 50 megawatts, wind projects that are greater than 100 megawatts, or storage projects that are greater than 50 megawatts, 200 megawatt hours, so 4-hour storage. And so, in case you haven't thought of much about how large-scale renewable energy projects are permitted, which maybe you haven't, in Michigan, it is mostly the local units of government, so which gets kind of abbreviated to LUG, township, county, city, or village, that has the final siting authority, so they can pass a restrictive ordinance if they want to keep out solar, and they have to kind of pass a special use permit, usually because it's not already in their zoning plan, for any large renewable energy project. And now, if you're a larger developer trying to kind of put a large-scale renewable energy project online, you can go through the local unit of government still, but you can also, as long as you meet a certain set of standards, so those would be kind of minimum setback standards, noise standards, union labor standard, which is one of the harder ones to meet in this. You can then take that project to the Michigan Public Service Commission, and it gets submitted in a docket, the way any regulated process works. And the Public Service Commission can kind of make the final decision on the special use permit, basically. There is a lot of complexity here, but those are the kind of the basics of it. And I'm happy to answer questions about that siting process if people are interested. What it doesn't touch is smaller projects below any of these thresholds, so those still need to be permitted locally. And then just briefly on PAs 231, 232, and 234. PA 231 allows the MPSC to consider climate, environmental justice, and affordability matters in IRP planning. We'll see how it gets interpreted in the actual regulatory processes, but it creates leeway for that type of interpretation. PA 232 creates a community and worker economic transition office in the Michigan Department of Labor. So that's supposed to help, education of people who work in the coal industry or any other types of like energy intensive industry that may be put out of business by the energy transition eventually. And then PA 234 is another important one on the siting side. It makes special land use permits irrevocable if construction has already begun and more than $10,000 has been spent, which is kind of nothing for renewable energy development. And the significance there is that it might make a developer more comfortable working with a local government if they know that a land use permit that they passed isn't going to be kind of revoked by a reactionary administration that comes in after them. By administration, I mean, local government council. So, right, these are very small bodies, very small numbers of people. And, one person can easily kind of change the way things flow at the local government level. And then I also wanted to point out Palisades. So, Palisades is an 800 megawatt nuclear plant on the western side of Michigan that closed in 2022. Holtec International purchased it from Energy with the express purpose of decommissioning it, but sort of changed that plan and said, look, if we can get enough financial support, we will work to reopen it. So they were able to get $1.5 billion in federal funding committed. So that grant, hasn't been given to them. It won't be given to them unless they get through all the other thresholds, but it's committed. 150 million in Michigan's 2024 state budget that was passed in 2023. And it is still under environmental review, but the kind of most recent headline was could restart as early as August 2025 if it can get through NEPA. That sounds pretty ambitious to me. We'll see. And I just thought this was a fun picture of Whitner and Granholm in the nuclear plant. So, everyone probably recognizes Gretchen Whitmer on the right, our current governor, but Jennifer Granholm on the left is the current Secretary of Energy for the whole United States. And, you have to assume that she helped get this done. So, what else is going on? While its dominance in auto manufacturing isn't as comprehensive as it once was, Michigan is still the state that produces the most vehicles by a long shot. And the state government has heavily incentivized the manufacture of batteries in the state. And this has produced kind of mixed headlines, especially around the $715 million incentive package that's going to Goshen, which is the American-owned subsidiary of a Chinese battery manufacturer. And, on this, I think it's an interesting one because it is inarguable that for the number of jobs produced, that's a huge incentive. Like those are very expensive jobs to be producing with economic development money. But my understanding is that the fear is really if we lose the battery supply chain, then we could start to lose the manufacturing of the vehicles overall in Michigan, assuming that electric vehicles become kind of the primary vehicle that's built in the US. So I find the politics there sort of interesting and complicated. And so, what's left to do? We're missing the ability to have community solar, and this is a big issue with the advocacy community. That was originally in PA 235, but was kind of stripped out during negotiations with the utilities. They really don't like the idea of community solar. There is legislation that is really bipartisan circulating around community solar right now. We'll see where it goes. It's not totally clear to me. I think it is kind of a bipartisan issue, but the utilities still have a lot of lobbying power in Lansing, and there's a lot of ways it could get pushed back further. There has been a lot of work done on building decarbonization. There's elements of building decarbonization kind of incentivization within PA 235, but there's a long way to go, and it's a hard and sticky process. So to get to kind of net zero emissions across all of Michigan, we're still a ways off of that. And then there's industrial decarbonization, which is really just getting started. My colleague, Elizabeth Boatman, was hired at 5 Lakes Energy explicitly to study pathways to industrial decarbonization. So I borrowed this slide from her. And I think, it's interesting to think about in this chart, you can see that 66% of industrial CO2 emissions in Michigan come from just 12 facilities. And then as stated, another 12 facilities represent the next 20%. So that's 88% from 25 facilities. So if you can work at the facility level, you really can make substantial improvements. However, cement, which is number one here, is really a sticky one because it requires very high temperatures to produce cement. And also, even if you could produce those high temperatures without fossil fuels, say with hydrogen, a lot of the emissions from the cement process are process emissions. So they're produced during I'm going to get this wrong, but during the burning of the lime to produce Portland or whatever. Someone's going to correct me on that. But the paper and paperboard industry are the second one, which is 17.5% of emissions. That one's potentially easier, right? There's a lot of electrification that could be done there. The process temperature is necessary much lower. So, we're kind of at the beginning of this, but people are putting kind of energy and money into the planning of it. And right at the 20-minute mark, that's the kind of end of presentation part 1.